Hello, everyone, and welcome to FO Talks by Fair Observer, an independent nonprofit media organization that informs and educates global citizens of today and tomorrow. I'm your host, Peter Isackson. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Fair Observer and also the author of Fair Observer's Devil's Dictionary, which has been running since 2017. I'm here today. We're very proud to have with us Alfredo Toro Hardy, who is a retired Venezuelan diplomat, a scholar, and a noted author with more than 35 books on international affairs to his name. He served as the ambassador to the US, the UK, Spain, Brazil, Singapore, Chile, and Ireland. He was also the director of the Diplomatic Academy. He's an honorary research fellow at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations and has been a visiting professor at Princeton, Brasilia, and Barcelona. Hardy has been a Fulbright scholar, a two-time Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center resident scholar, and an academic advisor to the University of Westminster. In other words, we've got someone very knowledgeable who's going to be talking about the subject of his latest book, America's Two Cold Wars, From Hegemony to Decline, ? The process has not finished, and we're going to learn about what direction it's taking. It's published by Palgrave Macmillan and it has come out this year. In it, he compares 40 plus years of the US-USSR Cold War, the one we all remember from history, with the emerging US-China Cold War. And he's going to explore two basic questions. The first, as a strategic competitor, how different was the Soviet Union to China, who is the current competitor? The second is, how different is the US of today from its former Soviet era self when confronting China? He will also examine the USSR's collapse. That's the regime that was in place before Russia and after Russia as well, because Russia's been there for a long time. So he'll examine how the USSR's collapse and China's emergence have changed things considerably, and we'll try to make sense of what may lie ahead for all of us. So thank you very much, Alfredo, for being with us. I'll let you take over, and you've got 20 minutes, half an hour if you need it, to develop these various themes, and then we'll go to questions and answers. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm very glad and honored to be within this Fair Observer's talk. And I would like to make a brief introduction about the content of my book. Then, having won its Cold War with the Soviet Union, the US emerged as the sole superpower in December 1991. It had been a more than 4 decades long contest, at the end of which the Soviet Union had simply exhausted its viability. It could not survive without changes, nor could undertake those changes without perishing. It was simply a doomed regime. For the better part of the following 2 decades, Washington enjoyed an undisputed global hegemony, a unipolar moment, in the words of Charles Krauthammer, had been attained, and with it, the liberal values proclaimed by the United States became truly universal. By 2008, however, China began developing an assertive foreign policy, which after 2013 extended into a wider and direct challenge to America's primacy. Under Xi Jinping, China aims at its resurrection. These translate into convergence strategies like the so-called China Dream of National Rejuvenation, or Made in China 2025, or the Belt and Road Initiative. Many of Chinese deeds, words, and proclaimed strategies present the country as a revisionist power, one that overtly challenges the status quo of its region and the leadership of the United States within it and overall. Several arguments have been given as reasons of why Xi Jinping's sense of urgency in challenging the prevailing international order. The first of those arguments holds that his initiatives are aimed at remaking the global order in terms favorable to China, given that when that order was shaped, China was a weak power and didn't have a say in the process. The second, conversely, maintains that Xi Jinping's actions are the expression of a Leninist political system struggling to keep its grip on power. The third argument states that Xi Jinping sees a narrow window of opportunity of about 10 to 15 years, during which his country can take advantage of a set of technological and geopolitical transformation that he describes as unseen in a century, and which demand therein an immediate action. Whatever the underlying reasons behind Xi Jinping's strategies and actions may be, the US feels threatened by them, with 73% of Americans polled by Pew Research Center holding a negative view on China. As a result, Washington is aggrievedly and forcefully reacting against what it perceives as an existential threat, as an existential contention. This in turn has increased Beijing's apprehension of being constrained in its ascendancy by what it considers to be another expression of the Western desire to keep China down. Moreover, and this have to be emphasized, having undergone the painful experience of a century of humiliation unleashed by Western powers and Japan, China perceives that America's actions are the last effort by a Western power to keep the country down, preventing it from occupying the rightful place it has the right to, it is entitled to. So, while the US feels threatened, China considers that it's been unfairly contained in its emergence. And as a result, a structural and increasingly zero-sum rivalry has taken shape between both giants. This new contest reproduces much of the animosity that characterized the decades-long confrontation between between Washington and Moscow during the First Cold War. Hence, while the possibility of a war looms in the air, a new Cold War between the US and China is clearly taking shape. To ascertain how well prepared the United States is to wage this second Cold War by comparison to the successful one that it waged with the Soviet Union, we have to ask ourselves two main questions. First, how different as a contender China is from the Soviet Union? And secondly, how different the current United States is in relation to its former self when confronting the Soviets. And the book precisely aims at answering these two questions. And it does it through the following proposition from a group of 6 propositions. The first one is from ideology to efficiency. These are the big changes that have taken place between the First Cold War and this emerging Cold War. The first proposition, hence, being from ideology to efficiency. Although multifaceted, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US had ideology at its core underpinning element, something for which the US was particularly well suited. Having been the birthplace of liberal democracy and its most devoted preacher, it was easy for it to reclaim the mantle of leader of the free world, particularly so after Woodrow Wilson had endowed its foreign policy with a missionary impulse in that direction. On the other side of the fence, the Soviet Union also embodied an ideology with that aim at global projection. The ideological contest between those two rivals, hence, was not only clear-cut, but unmistakable favorable to the US. Freedom, notwithstanding the contradictions that the free world notion entailed, was indeed an arrow directed to the Achilles heel of a totalitarian system as the Soviet system was. This emerging Cold War with China is not based on ideology. To begin with, America's liberal credentials have lost much of its credibility as they are being seriously contested home itself. Moreover, all that matters for China since Deng Xiaoping times is that the cat catches mice, meaning that the system delivers. Hence, not only America's liberal order has become an ideological non-starter, but what seems to matter in this rivalry is the capability shown by each to outmatch the other in terms of results. Efficiency, thus, becomes the catchword of this emerging Cold War, of this the defining element of this new Cold War. And contrary to the comparative advantage enjoyed by the US in its ideological contest with the Soviets, the country is badly prepared for a competition framed in efficiency terms. Indeed, America fares poorly in relation to other countries of the developed world in many areas because many of its problems have been left unbridled, unchecked for a very long time. Conversely, for a bit more than 4 decades, China has shown the most impressive historical record in providing results. Hence, there is this change from ideology to efficiency, where the US passes from having been particularly well suited to being in a very difficult predicament. The second proposition of my book is from hegemony to the squandering of alliances. And I must add that this has changed in the last few months after the Russia's invasion to Ukraine, and a couple of and the day later of having had this NATO summit in Madrid, where we saw this gathering of allies but having said that, the fact remains that the US did indeed squander the impressive gathering of allies that it had during its first Cold War. And nobody knows how long this new strength will remain in place. In any case, going back to the subject of my book, there I mentioned that in the final phase of World War II, or subsequently, a network of multilateral organizations, initiatives, and alliances began to take shape under American auspices. Through this network, the US positioned itself at the head of a potent hegemonic system, one in which its legitimacy was sustained by consensual acquiescence of the members of the so-called free world. American spectrum of allies was as diverse as was its capability to articulate the system on behalf of its Cold War objectives. On the other side, the Soviet Union gave rise to a much more modest system of alliances. However, within this competition, Washington Network remained the epitome of political, military, and economic strength. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the whole community of nations had to find arrangement under the US hegemonic system, which henceforward became global. Incomprehensible under the light of common sense, George W. Bush proclaimed the futility of multilateral cooperation, which in his view constrained the freedom of action to which the US power was entitled. And 8 years later, that Bush left the White House, we got Donald Trump with his dog eat dog foreign policy, which was a combination of unilateralism and isolationism, which served to erode even more America's alliance system, actually to shatter its America's alliance system. At that point in time, 2 years ago, Emmanuel Macron in France said that NATO was brain dead. And if there was a point in which allies coincided, was that America couldn't be trusted anymore. But as I was mentioning, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia seems to be changing this, but nobody knows if this is sustainable, if it could So if there is a long war, if this would remain in place, in any case, what is clear is that America's alliance system is not what it used to be. Conversely, China is forging a geopolitical bloc with Russia, in which you have two big powers getting together. And if you add to that China's multilateral economic initiatives that go in every possible direction and that are better symbolized by its Belt and Road Initiative, what you have as a result is that China is building stakeholders to its future, to its success in every corner of the world. Hence, China seems to be in a better position than the US. In any case, it was in a much better position until 3 months ago. The third proposition, it's from a strategic consistency to zigzagging. The 2 decades that succeeded the end of World War II represented the golden age of America's foreign policy. It was a highly rational period where consistency prevailed. A group of rules of the game and conceptual basis became associated with that period. And at its center, we have a fundamental guidance strategy, the containment of the Soviet Union expansionist impulse. From 1965 onwards, the Vietnam War turned America upside down, and its foreign policy system became, as a result, dramatically shaken. Not everything, though, changed. Although it became more difficult to maintain consistency in foreign policy issues, Washington was able to maintain it. And that consistency proved fundamental in confronting the Soviets with success. American foreign policy consistency at this point in time is inexistent. America was vertically split by its multiple divides, which was consistent with the anti-majoritarian nature of its system as constructed by its founding fathers. Nowadays, however, partisan identities have merged with the 2 big political parties, generating 2 overwhelming majorities which coexist side by side, trying to destroy each other. An overwhelming horizontal fracture is detaching not only the political system itself, but society as a whole. Foreign policy, as a result, enters into a zigzag period, as Republicans and Democrats inhabit in totally different foreign policy planets. Although China stands in a completely different ground. It has a clear national project and a well-grounded foreign policy aimed at providing support to that project. Even more, its geopolitical ambitions are more localized, interconnected, and in most cases closer to home. China marches towards its perception of what its destiny is, meaning becoming the #1 power in 2049. Hence, while the US zigzags, China knows exactly where it goes. The following proposition is from economic high ground to economic lowland, and I have to go a bit fast. At the end of the 1970s, the Soviet Union was sustaining the defense budget comparable to that of the US, but from a GDP base that was but a fraction of America's. Moreover, while the US economy was highly diversified, the Soviet one was exceedingly dependent on its oil exports, making its defense budget contingent on an inherently volatile raw material. If that the US quagmire multiplied upon Ronald Reagan's arrival to office, he not only sustained Jimmy Carter's decision to put an end to the tent, but went further, rolling back communism all around the world, attempting to make nuclear missiles obsolete by developing a strategic defense initiative that, while was years and decades ago, the Soviet believed that that was feasible for the Americans, I mean. And Reagan even pursued regime change in Moscow itself. Countering an offensive of this magnitude would have required an economic strength that Moscow was far from possessing. Simply put, the Soviets were pushed to the ropes by bankrupting its economy. China is in a different category altogether. It accounts for 25% of the global industrial output and contributes with around 1/3 of the world economic growth. In a few years' time, it will be surpassing America's GDP in absolute terms, whereas it already surpassed it in the purchasing power parity terms. Hence, while the US was in the economic high ground during its Cold War with the US, it's dwindling into the economic lowlands in relation to China. The final proposition I made in the book is from reasonable containment to unattainable containment. The US emerged from World War II as the richest and most powerful nation in the world, which should have translated in a period of supreme confidence on itself and its towering international presence. However, there was much uncertainty on the American side as they became conscious of the extent of its interconnections to the rest of the world. They became aware that only by way of an international environment favorable to their values and interests, protection could be found. And their fears were directed to an aggressive Stalin, whose country had emerged from the war as a military juggernaut and which seemed ready to exploit global instability on its behalf. The US most articulated response to that challenge came by way of its strategy of containment, a patient, systematic, and long-term containment of the US expansionist impulses. However, as Stalin understood that no new gains were possible within Europe itself, beyond the Iron Curtain, Soviet expansionism, and by consequence, American containment, moved into the third world. Frictions between the two superpowers were those removed from the most geopolitical combustible region of the world, and this substantially reduced the risk of a direct confrontation between them, with the notable exceptions of Berlin in 1960 and Cuba in 1962, both countries avoided geostrategic charge scenarios. Having been so successful in its containment strategy to the Soviets, Americans are trying to replicate the same containment strategy in relation to China. But this is a total different proposition. And the fact is that even if not framing as such, Obama, Trump, and Biden follow the containment road in relation to China. Of course, with any kind of master plan and amid multiple ups and downs around the road. However, is it possible from a geopolitical perspective to contain China? Is it viable to indefinitely constrain China to a secondary role in an area which is of geostrategic priority to it? Is it possible to do so given its layered defense in-depth control of the area, given its control of the theater of operation? How to contain a force whose main objective is precisely to deter penetration by others? So, it's if containment exceedingly well in relation to the Soviet Union, it doesn't seem to be a reasonable proposition in relation to China, at least geopolitically, where things really matter. In sum, during its first Cold War, the US had a wing on its back, with all the right configuration of factors supporting it. Now, the situation is the opposite. The configuration of factors seems to support China's position. The playing field doesn't favor the US as the core underpinning element, its main weakness, efficiency. The support base seems to be faltering as its credibility among allies. It's in a shaky position, or at least was 3 months ago. The consistency of purpose is weak, as its political parties inhabit in different foreign policy planets. The economic correlation puts it in a flickering place that in a few years' time, China would surpass America's GDP in absolute terms, and the final objective containing China seems unattainable. Hence, with such an auspicious outlook, common sense would advise that the US explores alternatives to Cold War with China, avoiding a zero-sum confrontation, accepting the inevitable emergence of China, and looking for constructive cohabitation. This all would seem as a reasonable proposition. However, even if the US would arrive to this conclusion, it is far from clear that China would. You need to for tango. And China might indeed be an unwilling tango partner, as it perceives itself to be at the time of the big power pushover. That is, amid great changes not seen in a century, and when time and momentum are on its side. So this is essentially the big picture of what my book says. And sorry if I exceeded my 30 minutes.
Well, that's fine. I mean, everything you said was vital interest, and you make a really solid case, which invites us all to reflect on two really serious moments of history. The second one of which we are living through now, and I think all of us individually have to decide what this means for us and how it impacts whatever's happening wherever we are and whatever powers we have to influence it. I really learned a lot, and I'm very grateful for everything you presented. There are a number of questions I would like to ask, and perhaps we invite, obviously, anyone in the audience to use the Zoom functions that allow you to participate in the discussion or to ask questions. It's a kind of depressing picture you painted, depending on what your point of view is, of course. But I mean, I can, as an American myself, I was born American, but I'm very much European, having lived almost all of my adult life in Europe, and I am a French citizen as well as a US citizen. So I have two perspectives on this. I can see everything you've said, I can recognize as being the way I was brought up during the first Cold War. So I totally identify with that. And now we're going through the Second World War, and Second Cold War. And I'm looking at it from Europe, from the point of view of Europe. And I see and Europe is in an interesting position because everything you're talking about, in both cases, Europe was halfway between the two major participants in the Cold War, Russia and the US in the first case, and now with China. So Europe has always been asking itself, what am I doing here? Who am I working with? And whom should I align with? And this is the big question today. So my first question to you, because you mentioned what's going on today as being a possible moment of inflection or of change in what you were talking about in terms of the US strategy of having and managing viable alliances with other nations. And you mentioned that, which we can all see every day, that with the sudden strengthening of NATO, it seems to be going back in a direction where the US is acquiring strength. But at the same time, I would say that it's also an indication of losing strength. And I think you said that by explaining what's going on in the rest of the world, that pushing China and Russia together, and actually, I mean, we could mention India and Indonesia and all that. The US is strengthening its alliances with some countries, but weakening it with the rest of the world. So could you say something about that, how you see that playing out? I'll just add one thing about the European situation. Here in Europe, things are not quite as clear as the media make it out to be in terms of the unity of Europeans. Politically, everyone has aligned with the idea that NATO has to strengthen itself to confront the Russian threat. But within Europe and within France, where I am, you can see it, that the belief that NATO is a viable response or a viable choice for representing Europe's interests today, I think is not as strong as the media make it out to be. Just talking to people I know tells me that there's a lot of ambiguity there. So could you say anything about the current situation and how you see this relationship I'm talking about, notably with Europe, but also the question of how those alliances, either in Europe or in the Western world, or the North American European world and how that relates to the rest of the world. Could you talk about that?
Yes, of course. I would like to make three points in relation to what you mentioned. The first one being the strength of the current alliances. Second, the meaning of the impact of the geopolitical bloc in the making between China and Russia. And third, the fluidity of current alliances vis-a-vis to what they used to be in the past. Let's go to the first point. How durable is this current alliance between the US and Europe and other countries? Well, it's difficult to ascertain. In 3 years' time, we could have Donald Trump back in the White House, and then NATO would be brain dead again. So, but on the other hand, this war in Ukraine could prolong itself for years, and who knows if the current strength of NATO would be able to support that. On the other hand, you were talking very interestingly to the fact that Europe sees itself in a particular situation in which it needs to develop its own autonomy of action, and it cannot keep depending on the US. So there are different forces there that could break, erode, or even break at some point in time in the future these alliances. The second point I wanted to make is in relation to this geopolitical bloc in the making between China and Russia. I must say that the US should have never allowed China and Russia to coalesce in the way they did. Probably this couldn't have been perceived or foreseen at the end of the past century, but clearly, or at the beginning of this century, but clearly so after 2008, the trends were very clearly visible. On the one hand, China became a much more assertive power. And on the other hand, Russia reacted to Western encroachments upon its borders with its invasion to Georgia. So at that point in time, the US should have chosen between the minor competitor, should have built bridges with the minor competitor so as to allow that these two converge in the way they have. The third point relates to the fluidity of current alliances. In the past, if you were a member of either of the two alliances, you were there. Well, of course, you could have been a non-aligned nation, but that was a different proposition. But if you were a member of the US hegemonic system or the Soviet one, you had to be reliable. Nowadays, you see India, by instance, which is a member of the Quad, and nonetheless has very good relations with Russia, keeps increasing its buy from Russian oil, has become the number 2 buyer of Russian oil. So it's a fluid alliance in which you are allied for a certain purpose, but for others, you go your own way. And the same goes for Israel. Israel is not subsuming itself under this American-led coalition against Russia. On the contrary, it considers that it needs to have an autonomy of action because Russia is its next door neighbor with its presence in Syria. Hence, there is a fluidity in place that makes that the alliance system doesn't work as it did. So
Yeah.
essentially, those were my 3 points.
I think that's very interesting, because it occurred to me that just what you're describing now can be summed up in a phrase that we all learned in 2003, or was it 2001? I can't remember, but it was George Bush who said, we're a coalition of the willing. And that is quite a different concept than an alliance. And it demonstrates what you're saying about the fragility and the fact that it's a very temporary phenomenon. It can change all the time. Of course, and what you said about Trump is something I've been saying. Europeans are very worried about any promises that the US makes, because if it's Biden who's making it, or if it's Trump who's making it, they don't know what the next president's going to do. On the other hand, I would just say one thing about a remark you made about US foreign policy. Do you really think that the Democrats and Republicans have a radically different foreign policy, or is there more continuity than we recognize?
I would say that they indeed inhabit in different foreign policy planets, but they have two issues that can gather them together, which are China and now Russia. But of course, it's not just a matter of having a bashing attitude towards China or having a bashing attitude towards Russia. You need a roadmap. You need a master plan. You need to converge in what the strategy is. And there is no strategy whatsoever. There is just an emotional reaction to what both parties perceive as a threat or as threats. But that doesn't transform automatically or necessarily in a strategy. And a strategy has to be worked, consensus has to be reached, and that's far from being the case.
Would you agree with an idea that occurred to me that as an American, that one of the reasons the US has been so incompetent in recent years in its management of foreign policy is because Americans themselves are not interested in foreign policy. So there is no real democratic debate within the country amongst the people. I'm not talking about what the politicians decide or say amongst themselves, but the indifference of Americans to foreign policy, in my view, has led to a simplification of the idea of the relationship you can have with the rest of the world or any other part of the world, which is why it's easy to fall into some kind of serious conflict, whether it's a Cold War or a proxy war or a hot war. Americans tend to simplify everything into either we're at peace or we're at war, but we don't have exchanges with other parts of the world because we're not interested in them. If you see what I mean.
Yeah. Well, I would say I would have 2 points in relation to that. And the first one would be that America's foreign policy has its own yin and yang qualities, meaning two opposites that are part of the same oneness. And the oneness being America's sense of, how to put it, moral superiority. And that translates into periods of yin or yang, the yin being a missionary impulse to change the world or to project your own model. And the young being indifferent to the rest of the world because they are not up to your high standards. Why to contaminate yourself with the rest of the world unnecessarily? Hence, America has shifted towards its history between these missionary impulses and these introspective periods. And that's the fact. That's the first that I believe it's present in American foreign policy. That's the point. And the second point being that America's fracture at this point in time, societal fracture, is so profound that the country, it's in an introspective process, in an introspective period, meaning your cultural wars within the US are so profound, or all the different elements. Society is divided between anti-abortion or pro-abortion, pro-weapons, or anti-weapons, carrying weapons. It's divided between looking at the past as an identity symbol, or trying to interpret the past at the light of current meanings and current society. So it's so divided that it's difficult that you can place your attention in what happens after.
Yes, I call that the binary temptation in American culture, which one tries to reduce everything to good versus evil. And the other, even your fellow American, is either on your side or on the other side, the way Bush formulated. So people are constantly thinking about who they are for and who they're against, and not how they're going to work together. Which brings me to the question about what you said concerning the possibility, which wasn't taken by the US starting in 2008, to have a cooperative vision of its relationship with China, since China was clearly emerging at that point. And it occurred to me that there was an easy solution to that, or an easy way of defining it, and that is in terms of a challenge such as climate change, where if the politicians on both sides, and you said that there was not only indifference on the American side, but opposition probably on the Chinese side, if they had simply said, look, we've got a big problem to solve, and it's in the interest of all of humanity, let's focus on that, and not be so concerned about our rivalry as to who is going to be the dominant hegemon. Were you thinking along those terms, that it would have been possible to address really global issues and have two hegemons that could cooperate on that? I mean, you did say that you didn't believe they could do it.
Well, that would be the most desirable option, to have some sort of G2 in which the two big superpowers cooperate to solve the big problems of humanity, which cannot be solved by either of them separately, or that cannot be solved without their consensus that goes from weather problems to pandemics to whatever. But the fact remains, from my point of view, that the big reason why we have this emergent Cold War is that there were two different lines of thinking. China was thinking strategically. And this all went down to Xi Jinping advice to its successors, where it said, win your time. Don't aspire to position of leadership. Low bow, meaning be as unremarkable as possible while you win time and you reach a position of power. So they were thinking strategic. Meanwhile, this strategic thinking was confronted by America wishful thinking, which consisted in believing that if they help China become prosperous, China would naturally evolve into a system akin to its own, meaning it would become more political democratic, it will become more liberal in terms of its economy. Hence, while China was thinking strategically, America was submerged in wishful thinking. And the confrontation of it made inevitable the problems we have today.
No,
because America feels aggrieved and feels betrayed in its good faith, and because it believed it was helping China becoming more similar to itself. And suddenly it sees something different. And at the same time, China is aggrieved and confronted because how could I have America believe that a 5,000-year civilization would simply become an appendix of America's civilization or America's way of being?
But that's because of the way we were taught in American schools, and that was that as soon as you gave the opportunity to any other group of people in the world, the opportunity to imitate what we do, they would do it spontaneously, and we believed that. We were taught to believe that was a basic, fundamental part of human psychology, that everyone wanted to be American. So it's very disappointing for Americans to discover that the rest of the world doesn't systematically think that way. We haven't had any other questions, but I'd like to, and we've actually run out of time, but I'd just like to throw in one more reflection. The first Cold War was all about the nuclear standoff. Well, today we're talking about a proxy war on the ground in another country where there's no engagement of personnel on the US side, but it's clearly a war between US and Russia and China, I suppose. What about the nuclear side of that? Because aren't we, you mentioned the 1962 Cuba crisis, missile crisis. Isn't it as dangerous today as it was then?
I would say that it is probably more dangerous nowadays because you don't have rules of the game. At that point in time, you have the doctrine of mutual assured destruction that was accepted by both sides. Nowadays, you see Russia talking easily about deploying nuclear arms, or you see that its doctrine contains the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons. So the constraints that existed during the First Cold War don't exist now. So I would say we're in a more difficult area now.
And there's one other thing is that Kennedy was willing to pick up the phone and talk to Khrushchev. I don't see Biden picking up the phone to talk to Putin. That's another cultural change that's taken place. The idea that dialogue might be serviceable in the solving of problems.
That's
Okay, we're going to have to stop there because we've run over the time, but thank you very, very much, Alfredo. I've learned a lot and very much enjoyed the occasion to speak with you, and hope to have other occasions as well.
Thank you so much for your enlightening questions. Very interesting indeed.
Okay. All right, so we'll close the session now, and thank you everyone who's joined and listened. And this will be available as a podcast on Fair Observer, and we will also publish the transcript as an article, so people can come back and study the very interesting things you've said, which are things we need to think about today. So thank you very much again. Thank you, everyone, for coming to listen.